As I mentioned last time, anger at foreigners was growing within Japan. Ports were forced open. Westerners were being allowed to live within Japan. And on top of that, Europeans and Americans had extraterritoriality while in Japan, which means that Americans and Europeans were not subject to the laws that every other Japanese citizen was. September 14, 1862 would be known as the Namamugi Incident. The daimyo of Satsuma Domain, Shimonosuke Hisamitsu, and his 400 to 600 armed bodyguards were on the way back south from Edo after being refused to see the shogun, something that angered him greatly. In the opposite direction was 4 Brits, a Shanghai-based merchant named Charles Lennox Richardson, and his friends, 2 merchants named Winthrop Clark and William Marshall, and his sister-in-law, Margaret Borrowdale. They were traveling on the road to visit the Kawasaki Daishi, a 750-year-old Buddhist temple. Richardson was about to retire and was doing some sightseeing before returning back to England. To do this, they had to pass through the village of Namamugi, the same village the Shimonosuke was passing through. Now, in Japan, it was customary to dismount your horse and bow as a lord passed. Richardson would do the opposite. No, he would ride right along the road. The Shimonosuke guards made constant gestures to get them to dismount. In response, he led his group right in between the guards and their lord's leader. One of the Shimonosuke guards in response took out his sword and slashed him. Clark and Marshall were also injured, but not the sister-in-law, and they were able to ride away. Not Richardson. He fell from the horse. The guards looked to their lord Shimonosuke, and he gave the order for him to be finished. On the screen now is an actual picture of Charles Richardson's body. An examination later would show that 10 of the wounds that he received were mortal. This, of course, caused many of the foreigners in Japan to become quite nervous, and many of them were outraged at what they perceived as murder. The Japanese defended the incident by pointing out that when the American Eugene Van Reed had come in contact with the daimyo, he had dismounted his horse and bowed, and nothing happened to him. This, rather than convincing the Europeans within Japan, upset them further. They thought Eugene's actions to be shameful, and many wrote their respective governments to take action against Japan. In response, the British government demanded that the shogunate have the Satsuma Domain pay reparations for the death. They also demanded that the bodyguards that committed the killing have a public trial and then execution. While the British government waits for these reparations, the Japanese emperor in 1863, between March and April, released an edict called Joijiku no Chokomei, or the Order to Expel the Barbarians. Over in Shimonoseki, the Chosu clan under daimyo Mori Takachika, without question, followed this in May. This was done without considering the shogun's government. Takachika ordered his men, without warning, to fire on all foreign ships sailing through the Shimonoseki Strait. The first attack happened on the 25th of June. An American merchant steamer named Pembroke was fired on by 2 European-built warships belonging to the Mori. Shouts from the Japanese crew could be heard to the stressed American crew. They yelled, "Revere the Emperor! Drive out the barbarians!" Most of the cannons that the Chosu were using were outdated, and they failed to do anything but cause minor damage to the Pembroke, which was able to escape, and would then report the attack to the U.S. consulate in Yokohama. The next day, a French steamship would also be attacked by artillery on top of the Shimonoseki bluffs. The vessel was pretty damaged, but still managed to escape with only 1 wounded sailor. After about 2 weeks had passed, and despite the warning from the crew of a French ship, a Dutch warship, HNLMS Medusa, sailed right into the strait. It was believed that because the Dutch and Japanese had a long-standing relationship, and while the vessel was much stronger than the bark, brig, and steamer ship that the Chosu had, that this would keep them safe. They were wrong. More than 30 shells would be fired at the ship, and 9 of the Medusa's crew would be killed. The ship would in turn fire its guns and force its way through to safety. After the attack on the Pembroke, American Minister Pruitt sanctioned an aggressive response. On July 14th at 5 a.m., the American warship Wyoming, under the command of Commodore McDougal, set sail for the Shimonoseki Strait. The next day, they anchored off of the island of Himashima. At 5 a.m. the next morning, the anchor was lifted and they started to steam towards the strait. The Wyoming entered into the strait at 10:45. Soon, after 3 signal guns were fired from land, alerting the Chosu batteries and ships to the arrival of the American warship. Around 11:15, after taking shots from shore batteries, the Wyoming raised her colors and fired her 11 guns in reply. Commodore McDougal then decided to ignore the batteries on shore, as he decided that the 3 ships were a greater threat. He considered it lucky that they were still at anchor. McDougal commanded his ship forward, noticing stakes in the water. He guessed that this was how the batteries were judging distance, so he made sure to have his ships steer clear of them. And he was right to do so, as the next round of shots barely missed. Instead, it just tore through her rigging. The USS Wyoming then passed between the ships with the bark and the brig on the starboard side, and the steamer at port. A shot came from the starboard side and struck the Wyoming, killing 2 and injuring 4. A piece of shrapnel would also fly out, killing a Marine. The Wyoming completed her run past the forts and then became grounded in shallow water. As this happened, the Japanese steamer began to head towards the Wyoming. The Wyoming had worked itself free from the mud, though, and fired her 11 guns at the steamer. 2 of these shots hit and blew up her boiler, and the ship began to sink. The Americans then made another pass and fired on the bark and brig, with the brig taking on water from the damage. After over an hour of fighting, the Wyoming returned to Yokohama. She had taken considerable damage, and it wasn't safe to continue the fight. Despite this battle, the Chosu would continue their aggression against foreign ships, but we'll come back to this later on. The Namamugi Incident hadn't yet been resolved, something that angered the British greatly. The lead shogunate representative, Ogasawara Nagamichi, negotiated during July 2nd on board the French warship Semiramis, I might get that wrong, and offered the British representative £100,000 and an apology. The British representative, Lieutenant Colonel Neal, threatened that they would bombard Edo if the payment wasn't made, and that they still wanted the Satsuma domain to put to trial the perpetrators and £25,000 from Satsuma. Satsuma made no attempts to either pay or apologize for what had happened. They felt they were in the right. With a year having passed, with the Satsuma domain ignoring the requests of the Brits decided to use force to get what they wanted. On August 6th, a British squadron left Yokohama. They arrived off of Kagoshima on August 11th and anchored there, and Satsuma envoys came aboard one of the ships to exchange letters. The commander demanded that the Satsuma give in to the demands within 24 hours, but would get no satisfactory answer. The British Royal Navy then decided to put pressure on them by seizing the 3 foreign-built steamships in Kagoshima harbor, in the hopes to use them as a bargaining chip. A typhoon then hit, and seizing on the opportunity, the Satsuma on the shore fired their round-shot cannons at the British. This caught the British off guard. They then set the 3 ships that they had captured on fire. They then moved their ships out of range of the Satsuma guns. And after 2 hours of prep work, they set their ships in a battle line and sailed along the coast of Kagoshima, firing their cannons. 5 Ryukyuan trade junks caught fire in this attack, and the returning fire would damage 3 British ships and killed 13 of their sailors, including a British captain and his second. 500 Satsuma houses would be destroyed in this bombardment as well, but only 5 people were actually killed as they had been evacuated before the shelling. The British would then pull back, having exhausted a lot of their supplies. Now, one of the men manning one of the Satsuma cannons, interesting enough, was Togo Haihachiro, who would later go on to be known as the father of the Imperial Navy. The Satsuma would later pay 25,000 pounds to the British. They got the money by borrowing it from the shogunate government, a sum that they would never pay. Well, you've made it to the end of another video. Click on some of the links right now to watch more of my videos, or hit that subscribe if you haven't already. What? Well, I told you to grab one last time, you didn't do it. Don't worry, I saved you one still.